All right, terrific. Shall I go ahead? I think we are all set. Thanks everybody for joining. It looks like a couple of people are connecting to audio. Super. Well, thanks everybody for joining, and I'm sure we will get more trickling in. And welcome to this webinar. I'm Nat Keohane. I'm the president of the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, or C2ES. And I've got a great set of folks with me today. There's been a lot of discussion around today's topic, which is the use of market-based approaches and how they can make a positive impact on climate ambition and corporate net zero strategies. And this has been an issue that has been a debate for, or at least a topic of discussion for a number of years. I think it's particularly salient now in the context of the Science Based Targets Initiative's recent statement on these tools. And what we wanted to do in today's webinar was bring together a range of perspectives from experts working on this in different ways, but to really talk about how those tools can advance climate action by corporates and increase climate ambition. So to set the stage, I just wanted to make 3 quick points to frame the conversation, and then I'll turn it over to the panel. First, why this matters. I think we all appreciate the urgency of the climate crisis, and in order to address the climate crisis, to avoid the worst impacts of climate change and have any hope of, frankly, of keeping the temperature rise well below 2 degrees and keeping the door open to 1.5 degrees, the goals of the Paris Agreement, we need much more finance to flow. Estimates range widely, but they're all in the trillions of dollars, and we are just not close to that now. And much of that needs to come from the private sector. There's no silver bullet, there's no single solution, but the kinds of market-based approaches that we'll talk about today can enable companies to invest in climate solutions, both inside and outside their value chains. Those can make a significant dent. They can contribute tens of billions of dollars or hundreds of billions of dollars annually, if done right. And that can be a significant step towards meeting that finance gap. Second, I just want to make the point and frame up the conversation that even within those area of market-based approaches, there are lots of different approaches. And I just want to sort of clarify some terms, identify some differences so that kind of signposting some of the conversation ahead. You'll hear several of these terms in the webinar. First, the overarching term, and the one that SBTi's board used, as environmental attribute certificates. That's a real mouthful, but it includes a lot of different types of market-based approaches that have the common attribute of accounting for investment in climate solutions and climate finance that yields emissions reductions, and then being able to provide some form of credit for that. They range from traditional carbon credits that might be carried out by projects or activities using methodologies by carbon crediting programs like Verra or Gold Standard, towards a newer range of what you'll hear from Kim about kind of green certificates, basically for emissions reductions in the production of green commodities, sustainable aviation fuel, low carbon steel, and there's a range of things in between. So this environmental attribute certificate covers a range of instruments. You'll hear about some different ones today, and I think many of them can provide real ability to drive finance into climate solutions. It's also useful to distinguish a couple of, one big distinction. You'll hear today some of these approaches really focus within a company's value chain. So how can companies get accounted for, get credit for investments made within their value chain, maybe helping their suppliers reduce emissions way upstream. Other approaches are outside a company's value chain. They might be further ranging, but still represent real emissions reductions, maybe protecting nature, protecting forests. And of course, there can be some overlap, but you'll hear sometimes the within value chain is called insetting. Maybe you'll hear that term. Sometimes you hear the word offsets. You'll also hear different perspectives on where that money can flow, but I want to make that point as well. And then finally, we're just talking about a lot of climate solutions here. These environmental attributes, or these market-based approaches, can be used to reduce emissions in industry. They can be used to reduce emissions in transportation. They can be used to reduce emissions in fuels. They can clean up the electric power sector. They can be used to protect nature and nature-based solutions. And again, you'll hear different views and voices on this panel. I think the common thing you'll hear about the panel, because you'll hear different perspectives and different approaches, but the common theme is we need to mobilize much more climate finance, that companies can play a critical role in doing that. And SBTi can play a key role by allowing the appropriate use of these approaches to help companies meet their targets with appropriate thresholds and guardrails to ensure that companies also continue to decarbonize their operations and value chains. So third and last, let me just say one word on what this means for SBTi, or why this I think is important. Look, from my point of view, SBTi plays a really critical role in this space. They have become the leading organization helping companies set science-based targets that can be a major driver for climate action, and that's an amazing accomplishment. And when I hear from companies, I talk to a lot of companies. It's part of the work we do here at C2ES, and I hear two things from nearly every company I speak with. Number one, companies want to reduce their emissions. They want to, leading companies, not every company, but companies that are leading in the climate space, they want to reduce their emissions, but they don't have all the tools, particularly around scope 3. Scope 3 emissions are the ones outside of a company's direct control, outside their own operations, and outside the energy that they purchase, the electricity that they purchase, and so on. So emissions from suppliers up their value chain or consumers down their value chain. Those are the hardest ones to to control, and Roger will talk more about that. So they want tools to meet their targets. And if they don't get those tools, they're worried about how they can meet and make more ambitious targets. Second, companies are willing to make millions of dollars, in the aggregate, billions of dollars of investments in climate solutions that they think will work, but only if they're given a pathway to do that with credibility and integrity. So I think what you'll hear today is how we can achieve both those goals, both allow and enable and push companies to set and meet ambitious Paris-aligned, science-aligned targets and give them the tools to do that, while also driving billions of dollars, potentially of finance, into climate solutions and sustainable development in the global south. This is the climate hawk case in favor of the SBTi's announcement. So I'm joined by three really terrific experts on the panel, all with deep expertise in the inner workings of corporate decarbonization and the use of market-based approaches. And I just want to go right to them. I'll go to them in order. First, Kim, then Roger, and then Will. So first, Kim Carnahan is CEO of the just established nonprofit Center for Green Market Activation, among other titles. Kim has over 15 years of experience in climate change and energy, and has been focused specifically on helping companies decarbonize their value chains for the past several years, including through her work leading the Sustainable Aviation Buyers Alliance, or SABA, and the Zero Emission Maritime Buyers Alliance, ZEMBA, and in managing the AIM platform. So Kim, I know you work on value chain decarbonization. I talked about it in setting, and that's really your exclusive focus. So can you just share with us and with the folks on the panel, on the webinar, why market-based approaches are needed to address scope 3 emissions from your perspective, and how these in-setting approaches can play a role?
Yeah, happy to, Nat. Thanks so much. It might be helpful to start by explaining kind of how I got into the value chain decarbonization or in setting space in the first place. As you just mentioned, one of my roles, or as I, and is also kind of possible to have seen on LinkedIn, et cetera. One of my roles at the State Department when I was there for kind of about a decade was managing energy and environment policy for the U.S. government on aviation. And when I left state, I was very frustrated with the very low uptake of sustainable aviation fuel and the rate of decarbonization in the aviation space, particularly because I knew there were many corporate customers who had taken on science-based targets under SBTi, which we're talking about right now, and were willing to pay a significant premium to decarbonize their use of aviation so that they could achieve their targets. I knew this because they told me, and a few of them had even begun conversations with airlines about how they could do so. Now, the premise or the philosophy of SBTi to date has been that companies should take responsibility for all of the emissions that underlie their business models, not only those related to the activities under their direct control. This means they need to find a way to address the emissions of their suppliers and their suppliers, and on and on and on. If GHG accounting in GHG accounting parlance, the term for this, as you mentioned, is scope 3, but we also hear supply chain and value chain emissions used interchangeably. I will use, as a general rule, value chain mitigation or value chain emission reductions, because the value chain comprises a company's upstream and downstream activity emissions. But now back to those companies trying to pay the premium for SAF so that they could address their aviation emissions. We learned a few things in those first few arrangements that I worked on. First of all, there was no alignment on what was being transacted. Companies didn't know, were they buying a ton of SAF emission, the emission reductions associated with a ton of SAF? Were they buying a ton of CO2? How was that being calculated, et cetera? Two, there was no competition and no price transparency. No competition among the fuel providers, of which there were few. No price transparency on what the airlines were paying when they were buying fuel from the fuel providers. So there was a chance for gaming in that system. There was also little to no certification to any kind of sustainability standard. So we really weren't sure that the fuel that was being supported by these early stage agreements, these first of kind agreements, were supporting truly sustainable staff. There was also no public or transparent allocation of the Scope 3 emissions benefits being purchased. It was basically an email being sent from an airline to a customer saying, own these emission reductions, go forth and claim them. And then finally, and most importantly, there were very few companies who were going to be able to engage in this kind of bilateral deal with an airline. I mean, the ones that I worked on took over a year to finalize a single purchase. And frankly, a company that is determined to be the leading edge of action of aviation decarbonization would be willing to do that, but almost nobody else would be willing to, or would have the time, the staff time, energy, resources to allocate to what in the end became a really small fuel purchase, actually. So there needed to be a better solution to what was a really good idea, I think, which is trying to get companies to decarbonize the sectors in which they rely. And so this particular experience led me to a couple of conclusions. If companies were going to have any way to meet their SBTs with mitigation from within their value chain, from sectors on which they rely, we were going to need three things. One, a standardized system dictating the rules of the road in terms of product definition, how to allocate emissions benefits, contract terms, et cetera. Two, we were going to need a way to encourage competition to ensure fuel prices are set reasonably and to ensure airlines aren't tempted to upcharge, frankly, on their own decarbonization. And three, there needed to be support for Scope 3 buyers in terms of like what fuel to buy and how to ensure that it is truly sustainable. I mean, these companies know little to nothing about aviation. They're banks and consultancies and tech and apparel companies. It's just not their business. And certainly this extreme technicalities related to biofuels or e-fuels is not something that they've been schooled on before. So the outcome of this experience is that at the time I partnered with the Environmental Defense Fund and RMI, the Rocky Mountain Institute, to start the Sustainable Aviation Buyers Alliance to address these issues, because we believed it was the only way to really scale corporate-led aviation decarbonization to activate the incentive that SBTi had created. And SABA has been very successful. We just did an announcement yesterday. We raised $200 billion in our last RFP from only about 20 companies. The sky is really the limit. I didn't mean to make a pun there in terms of what we can accomplish with these types of tools. But it turns out that the challenges faced in addressing Scope 3 aviation emissions are replicated across hard to abate sectors. And so the same types of systems, notably in our case, a book and claim chain of custody system, combined with NGO vetted sustainability requirements and procurement support, that's going to be needed across the board to help Scope 3 emitters drive decarbonization in their value chain transparently and credibly. So we at the Center for GMA, with many supportive environmental NGO partners, are doing just this, and companies have been very receptive to it. But we still face one big hurdle. SBTi has not yet said that these systems we are building can count, and the use of these systems can count towards a company's science-based target. They're basically pointing to the GHG protocol and to their accounting standard and saying, follow that. That is whatever your inventory is, and that's how you determine whether or not you meet your target. But GHGP hasn't updated their protocol, their accounting standard, to allow for Scope 3 to be allocated to particular companies in the way in the example that I just gave earlier about aviation. I'm paying for you to buy more decarbonized fuel. I need some sort of proof that I've done that, it's not going to show up in United Airlines emissions factor that I'm using to develop my GHG inventory. There is no rule that says how I can include the reductions that I purchased or the fuel that I supported in my inventory today. Um, and this problem is repeated across every single sector because GHGP relies on attributional accounting, which requires a static inventory of absolute emissions and removals utilizing data that is based on a physical relationship. So I can, prove that using your emissions factor for your particular service, your particular good, and I can prove through a contract that I bought from you, either using that or what most companies do is they use a global default or a regional default in some cases. And really neither of those cases is my purchase of 1,000 tons of emission reductions going to show up. So it's not that we have a problem with GHG inventories that are based on attributional accounting. It's just that we need something extra to go along with that to make sure that the type of work that I'm supporting can be counted towards a company's climate totals, to their, to be counted towards their science-based target, but also just more broadly, they want to share this good work that they're doing and supporting their value chain decarbonization with the world, and they want a way to do that. So an initiative was launched about this time last year. It's called the AIM platform to develop a standard and guidance that provides companies clarity on how to credibly claim the results of mitigation interventions in their value chain. If they're using book and claim, what do the rules have to be? What kind of sustainability certification has to be put in place? How do they actually do the math? How do they count the reductions or take credit for the emissions profile of the good or service that they are supporting in their value chain? This is important stuff. SBTi and GHGP, who are observers to the AIM platform process, which is run by a governing committee of experts from philanthropies, NGOs, standards, climate leading companies, we all work together to develop the standard and guidance now. And we're really hopeful that SBTi and GHGP eventually will clearly and unequivocally approve the use of this standard and guidance to determine that value chain reductions, like that aviation example I gave in the beginning, can be counted towards the achievement of the climate target. But right now, they can't. And so what's happening is companies are disclosing their support for these types of approaches, but they're not ramping up their support for these kinds of approaches. And that's what we need to see. We need to see companies get the full steam ahead, green means go, absolute approval, permission really to spend their money supporting the decarbonization of hard to abate sectors. And that's what we're missing right now, and what kind of an update like the one that was insinuated in the Board of Trustees announcement earlier this month would enable. I recognize that there need to be a lot of rules or guardrails around what counts, and absolutely we at the AIM platform would support that, and we're kind of trying to help them towards the kinds of rules and guardrails that we think are appropriate through the development of the AIM standard and guidance. Sorry, I think I'm a little bit over time, but I'll stop there, and happy to answer questions later.
Thanks, Kim. That's super. And so I think that's a great, very clear and concrete example of the sort of thing and the sort of approach that when the SBTi board announces it's going to be looking at, EACs or market-based approaches, this is the kind of thing they could be looking at and the kind of thing they could be considering and the kind of investment that might be unlocked. So next, I want to go to Roger Valentine, who's the president of Green Strategies Incorporated. Roger has decades of experience in the private sector and in government working on climate and energy solutions. In his current role, he provides management consulting services to corporate and financial sector climate clients on sustainability strategy and, most critically and relevantly for today, on corporate decarbonization. He's also a venture partner with Arborview Capital LLC, which makes growth capital investments in clean energy and energy efficiency. So a lot of real deep investment or experience in this space and knowledge on sort of the current corporate space. So Roger, can you unpack takeaways from your research? I know you've done a lot of research into some of the challenges around Scope 3 decarbonization. Share a little bit about that research and your perspective and findings.
Great, I will. Thank you, Nat, and thanks everybody for the opportunity. And I'll share what I found in my research. Although I will say the most effective research I've done is spending the last 23 years closely advising companies on how to decarbonize and how to be climate leaders in a way that provides value to the environment and also business value as well. So I thought the best thing I could do is step back a little bit initially and put some things in context, and then talk about scope 3 more generally, and then come back to the problem at hand. So Nat provided one piece of the context. I'll add a little more detail to that. Credible estimates put the amount of investment we need to meet global net zero targets in the $8 to $10 trillion per year range, with estimates being about 80% of that's going to have to come from the private sector. So even in our wildest dreams of what governments might do, the bulk of the work here is going to have to be carried through private capital. Now, that then leads to why this particular topic, the topic of SBTi and greenhouse gas accounting protocol, and all of these elements of what I call the rules and rewards ecosystem that influences corporate behavior, it matters. It matters a lot. And with an example, SBTi in particular, the companies that have validated science-based targets around the world account for more than 1/3 of global market capitalization. This is very significant, and that represents, frankly, tremendous success on the part of the rules and rewards ecosystem, SBTi in general. And they deserve a lot of praise and credit for that. With that success, however, comes responsibility, and I think appropriately scrutiny. And while there's no plausible justification, reason, mission for SBTi and the protocol and the ecosystem, other than driving the reduction, avoidance, and removal of greenhouse gas emissions. That's it. That's what it should be, and that's what it should be all about. But because of that, every aspect of these rules should be assessed on that basis. How well are these rules driving investment and capital towards the avoidance, reduction, and removal of greenhouse gases? When we look at scope 3, the answer to that question is not very well. And there's a number of reasons for this, and let me just dive into those and give a couple examples. So part of it is, Kim used and Nat both used the term value chain. And the concept of the company's value chain is inherently logical, right? Because a company exists in what it does in its daily business, it has ripple effects upstream and downstream, and ripple effects in our economy mean greenhouse gas emissions. So that makes a lot of sense from a theoretical perspective. However, from a execution perspective of what to do in that value chain, how to operate in that value chain, that gets extremely difficult. So keep in mind, for an example, part of my value chain, not just my supplier's emissions, my supplier's emissions, my supplier's emission. And at this point, I don't even know who these companies are, me, the company, looking at my value chain. I don't even know who they are. So this raises, one of the fundamental problems, in my view, with the current SBTi approach, which is they say before you can even get a science-based target, you have to have a complete and accurate scope 3 inventory. Well, the fact is that no company ever has, and no company ever will calculate a complete and accurate scope 3 inventory. It is simply not possible. And even that's kind of acknowledged, somewhat inconsistently acknowledged, because then SBTi says, okay, we know you're actually not going to be able to get all this data and find all these emissions in your value chain. So go ahead and use modeled data, proxy data, secondary data, basically educated guesses. And that's creates two problems. One, we're sacrificing accuracy, because by definition, those aren't actual emissions. They're good guesses at those emissions. More importantly, relative to the purpose of this discussion, it sacrifices actionability. How do I mitigate emissions that are in my inventory when they're actually not emissions that I know whose they are? I don't even know exactly what they are or where they are. That's a huge problem. So actionability should be first and foremost, back to our original framing. All of this should be held up against how well are these rules actually driving beneficial climate impact. So that's a first kind of problem there. And companies are going to, as Nat said, let me just say, this is an entirely different world than when I started working in space more than 2 decades ago. There are many, many companies with lots of capital who want to have an impact. They want to be climate leaders. They want to earn climate leadership. But we find in the Scope 3 context, under these current rules and approaches, they are actually often dissuaded from doing so, directly contradictory to our opening point, which is we need this capital to flow, not to be held back. I'll just give one example. In my most recent journal article on Scope 3, there's a bunch of these examples, but I'll just give you one very easy to understand one, and that is what I refer to as kind of the free rider problem. So let's say in a case where I know the actual emission numbers, I know the direct emission numbers. So let's talk about my supplier, okay? And I know my supplier, for example, has a very old and leaky HVAC system, okay? So I know if I go in there and finance or co-finance, but if I finance the upgrade and replacement of that old, inefficient, and leaky HVAC system with a state-of-the-art, high-efficiency unit, I know emissions are going down. They're my supplier's emissions, but they're my Scope 3 emissions. So will I make that investment? Well, the answer maybe, and often, is no. Why? Because even though that's my supplier, I'm a big customer, let's say I'm a 20% customer of that supplier, I go reduce those emissions of my supplier, I only get quote unquote credit for 20%, because that's what flows into my inventory using, as Kim pointed out, this rigid attributional accounting approach we use to both greenhouse gas emissions under the protocol and under SBTi. So I don't make that investment. And there's a bunch of other examples of that. The other thing that's really important to keep in mind here, it's stunning to me over the last several decades how much money companies are spending on climate. And whether that's, they got extensive climate teams, tons of consultants. That's the good news. The bad news is they're not unlimited. Corporate climate budgets are not unlimited. And the effect of how we do Scope 3 now is, every dollar we ask companies to spend chasing more and more data deeper and deeper in the supply chain, or paying, God forbid, high-priced consultants and software providers and all this to chase that data. Those are dollars that are not being spent directly reducing, avoiding, and removing greenhouse gas emissions. That is a suboptimal outcome. It's because we are focused on inventories and process far more than what we actually care about, which is solving the climate problem. So this is one of the reasons what SBTi announced last week is really so welcome, because markets are really, really good at deploying capital for the highest possible return. When into that return equation, we put climate, and that may be in the form of getting credit towards their climate target and being known as a leader and touting that leadership and impact to employees and investors and customers. That matters to companies. That is return to them. And they're really good at finding ways to spend that money to maximize that return. Right now, the return they are getting for that is very much blunted and pointed in directions other than direct climate value. And that's a huge problem. The use of market mechanisms brings what markets do very, very well in service of meeting the climate challenge. So it's very, very hopeful that the direction that SBTi is pointing to, because there is a lot of capital that is either not being spent at all in some of the examples that I gave here and more in my paper, or capital that's being spent on things that actually don't provide that much climate value, but companies are kind of told to do that. If we can re-optimize that capital deployment in the private sector towards direct, verified emissions impact, we're going to be more on our way to deploying the capital we need to actually try to meet the challenge of the climate crisis. I'll stop there, Nat. We can get into more details later.
Thanks, Roger. And I think that emphasis on actionability and on what companies are able to do, especially in their Scope 3 emissions, and what these market approaches could allow them to do and taking action is a really important one. So now, let's turn to the third member of our panel. Dr. Will Turner is a Senior Vice President at Conservation International for Natural Climate Solutions. His work focuses on utilizing natural climate solutions to absorb carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere at massive scale. And we've been talking a lot about investments in the value chain and industry, but investments in climate and nature and finance for protection and for nature-based solutions is also a critical part of the puzzle. So Will, what is the current need for financing in climate action, and what role do you see that businesses and these sorts of market-based approaches we've been talking about have as part of high integrity forest and climate solutions?
Thanks, Nat, and great to see you all. So in financing climate action, here we're focusing on climate mitigation action, right? To avoid the most dangerous impacts of climate change. And the need there is estimated to be in the trillions of dollars annually for the coming decades. Some of the most reliable estimates to date are on the order of 9 or 10 trillion a year by the end of this decade, and we basically need to get there immediately. Right now, total climate mitigation related finance of all kinds, again, depending on the accounting that's used, maybe $1 trillion annually. So at least tenfold increase needed very quickly. But let's talk about what the financing is for. So climate is lots of bad news, as we know, but some of the good news is that we actually know what we have to do, right? We know that any credible strategy for addressing climate change does 3 things. Foremost, it means decarbonizing energy and industry. It also means probably pursuing new carbon removal technology. And third, and significantly, it means protecting and restoring nature around the world. We need to rapidly shift forests and other parts of the land sector to zero in emissions by, say, 2030, and we won't hit our climate goals without that. So what does that look like? That's protecting existing forests and other high carbon ecosystems that store vast quantities of carbon, reducing the emissions that are a substantial part of emissions coming from nature right now. It means restoring nature, where massive parts of the world's forests and other ecosystems have already been cleared, and there's both a need and an opportunity to regrow those ecosystems and bring massive amounts of CO2 out of the atmosphere, reductions at scale. And then there's a third category, which is the management of lands that are used for production of fiber, timber, forestry products, of grazing lands and agriculture. The potential of that is also huge. That one involves both reductions and removals, but is critically has people still earning livelihoods and producing what humans need on those lands. So that's natural climate solutions, is all of those. We have the science that helps us understand that that's some 10 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent reductions and removals potential by, say, 2030, all without compromising biodiversity, without compromising people's ability to produce on the land. It's important to understand that to address climate change, all 3 of these categories, energy, new technologies for carbon dioxide removal, and natural climate solutions, are essential. So first, obviously energy and industry is the most important and the biggest, but we can turn every car to a electric, all energy, electricity production, solar overnight, and we will still fail to achieve the Paris climate targets or avoid the most dangerous impacts of climate change as long as the Amazon is cleared or Sumatra burns. We will simply fail, and there's nothing that we can do in technological carbon dioxide removal or anything else that will overcome that. If we don't address the biggest category, energy and industry, clearly there's nothing that the other 2 categories can do to make up for it. So all 3 of these have to be done. There is no question, and there can't be any substitution at a global scale that lets us ignore one of these categories for the sake of the others. The financing of these across every one of these categories is still grossly inadequate. There's nothing that is sufficiently financed. So this isn't a question of we need to reallocate from one to the other because some are doing just fine. We need to finance across the board. Natural climate solutions, though, are really critically underfunded. You've got communities and countries around the world that steward the ecosystems that literally humanity and our planet depend on. And they're all around the world, particularly in developing countries in the global south, with grossly inadequate funding for these ecosystems. And even with the growing recognition that I think we've seen in the last, since, you know, the word nature first appeared in climate talks in the Paris Climate Agreement 10 years ago, and we've had increasing interest in, say, the last 5 years or so, finance has only increased from 2% to maybe 3% of all climate finance going to natural climate solutions. So as a result, the vast majority of this potential that is very much there remains untapped. If you think about the reasons for that, I think one of them is the lack of incentives within current accounting and reporting frameworks for the private sector to make the investments that can maximize impact for the climate. And it matters because there seems to be this expectation that we can ignore these kind of market-based approaches because laws and public funding are the way to drive this. And laws and public funding and other actions are absolutely important, but if our strategy for addressing climate change is waiting for success in governments passing legislation and allocating budgets, we are simply sacrificing the future of our children and those they share this planet with. So that's why we need to thoughtfully include market-based approaches as part of the solution for driving climate action. We know that the potential of market-based approaches to dramatically increase and speed the amount of mitigation to happen in the coming years is enormous. And it's worth thinking about kind of the simple math of this. We know that the distribution of mitigation potential from the energy transition parts of things, natural climate solutions, all of it varies widely around the world. And the costs of those activities, these mitigation activities, varies also. What that means is if we have a system that enables trading emissions credits or other market approaches, it can have a huge impact. In the next 15 years, trading emissions credits, for example, could result in gigatons fewer emissions, trillions of dollars flowing, and primarily that's dollars going from developed to developing countries, and a vastly greener planet than if we don't have this happening. That's what the degree of underfunding that there is currently now means, and the opportunity with market-based approaches. That just comes about because the cost of mitigation varies in space. But there's an if here. If we are going to realize that massive potential, you would need to see the system designed with the right guardrails so that the use of market approaches massively accelerates mitigation. And that's what it means to be science-based, that focus on high integrity. And I think SBTi's announcement to explore how market-based approaches fit in is therefore among the most science-based things that they've ever done. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Will. And thanks to all of you for your insights and expertise today. So we're going to open the floor now if there are questions. I have a couple. I know we have several folks on. If you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand or throw it in or put it into the chat. But let me start, and if you do have a question, just jump in, as I said, or raise your hand. But let me start and ask whether sort of what has changed in a sense. So just to give a bit of history here, SBTi back in October of 2021, I think it was, came out with its, originally came out with a framework that said carbon credits, they would not be appropriate for use. In that case, it was specifically carbon credits would not be appropriate for use in companies meeting their targets, although they encouraged companies doing that beyond those targets. And so now we've had kind of 2.5, almost 3 years of work since then. So what's changed? And I'm interested in all your thoughts on sort of what's changed in the landscape since that original announcement that may make it, that merits that makes sense for the board and for SBTi and the organization to be taking another look at this issue.
I'll just throw out two quick things, Nat. One, what's changed most fundamentally is the climate. We are failing. So what was urgent is now even more urgent. So I think that's one. Two, you're involved in this, as are others. There has been a very extensive, dedicated effort to put in systems and processes to ensure the integrity of market mechanisms of credits. Again, nowhere in this entire ecosystem is perfection a reasonable goal, but the system has improved dramatically, and I think that's a really important piece of the change.
Thanks. Yeah, and as you say, several of those efforts, there's been a lot of since 2021, recognizing that there were a lot of questions. This is specifically around the carbon credit piece of this, recognizing the questions around quality and integrity that have been raised. There's been a lot of efforts to raise and enhance that integrity, both on the supply side, the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market, and on the demand side in terms of the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative. So just thinking about, one of the things that SBTi talks about is the guardrails that ought to be placed on this to make sure that, we're focusing, we're not doing this in place of decarbonization, but alongside decarbonization. And I think those efforts are in place. I guess one thing I was just going to, maybe point to you, Kim. I mean, one thing I on my mind, and maybe you can talk more about, is since that October 2021, there's been a lot of innovation. I mean, so many of the things you talked about in terms of the book and claim piece and that sort of within value chain piece have also really, those innovations have really come out since that time as well.
Yeah. No, yeah, I was going to jump in and say what's happened since 2021 is that companies were trying to address their emissions within value chain. We're trying to address their scope 3 emissions as they had been directed to by SBTi, and found that even they, in those instances, need market-based approaches, need a way to take credit for reductions that they have incentivized in their value chain, because the current GHG protocol accounting guidance doesn't allow them to do that, doesn't provide an avenue for them to do that. So we've tried the really hard thing, and some have succeeded in doing the really hard thing of driving decarbonization in very hard to abate sectors with, by the way, very expensive price tags attached. Anywhere from $250 to $800 a ton is what we're seeing sustainable aviation fuel emission reductions cost in terms of paying the premium for that fuel. So companies are trying very hard, but they still need this market-based approach in order to take credit for it against their science-based target. So, and then specifically to the book and claim piece, book and claim, this concept of booking a volume or an amount of good or service into a registry and kind of separating the environmental attributes from the physical good is not a new concept. It's one that has been used in the renewable energy sector for a long time. With, I might add, some rules that we have significantly improved upon in the SAF space, and which we continue to improve upon in the other sectors that we're moving into. But so it's not a new concept, book and claim, but it didn't exist with the level of rigor that it does now. The SAF certificate registry was launched only last December in 2023. And it now provides a publicly accessible, transparent way for anyone really to go and see what SAF that companies have supported, how much, where it was, where that SAF was uploaded, what airline, used the SAF, what environmental certification that SAF came with, what the feedstock for the SAF was, what the SAF was made of, et cetera. So lots and lots of information, and really stringent rules for how the system functions. And we don't have time to go through all of those today, but very happy to talk through them at some point in the future. And just to note that other sectors that are commodities, right, that have highly commoditized, homogeneous goods and services can use that same approach in a way that allows almost like a conveyor belt of emission reductions to start going as soon as companies are willing to pay the green premium associated with decarbonizing that commodity. So that's what book and claim enables, is significant standardization and this very, relatively quick scaling compared to the snail's pace that I saw when I was working at the State Department and being frustrated by the lack of progress within the aviation sector.
If I could just add one, which is basically evidence. If you're there was two reports done by Ecosystem Marketplace, one 7 or 8 years ago and one that came out last year, that actually found that those companies that use carbon credits or make some investment in carbon credits are disproportionately likely to be making deep decarbonization within their own operations and impact, which is evidence of exactly what you would hope to see. I think that coupled with Roger's second point, which is like, it's nice to see the evidence. It's actually nice that as the number of companies grew between those two analyses, the level of decarbonization and that association between the use of market mechanisms and actual decarbonization increased. That's great, but you also don't want to just count on that magically continuing. So Roger's second point about like actually making sure that the rules ensure that that outcome continues are really important. They're kind of complementary, but that's a significant change relative to where we might have been 5 years ago.
Yeah, thanks, Will. And actually, I wanted to pick up on that and maybe follow up on that and see, Roger and Kim, if you have thoughts on that as well. I think the this issue that Will raised about the extent to which is there a trade-off? I mean, some of the concern around these market-based approaches is, oh, somehow this is going to let firms off the hook, or it's going to let companies off the hook. But Will mentioned some of the evidence. I've seen other evidence, Trove Research released some evidence. There's been some others, but I'd love for you all to talk a little bit about this. I think what I've seen, at least from the companies I see and from some of the research I've seen, is it's actually the companies that are investing the most in their own decarbonization that are also the companies that are looking to invest the most in these market-based approaches, because it's the leading companies who are really committed to climate action in both cases. So this becomes not an either or, but more of a both and. But I wonder if Kim or Roger, you're nodding, so maybe I'll go to you and then to Kim, like if you can shed some light on that, or in your own experience of the research you've seen.
Yeah, look, if we keep focused on the bottom line here, which is tons, that's what this is about entirely. All this is pretty easy to solve. I understand the sentiment that companies should first and foremost reduce their own emissions, and as Nat pointed out, the companies that are doing the most in the voluntary carbon markets, the ones who are doing the most are also doing the most to reduce their own emissions. From a pure climate perspective, just to dumb it down with an example, if the next marginal ton of reducing my own emissions costs $100, but I can spend $100 and reduce 2 tons in somebody else's value chain, there is absolutely no ambiguity about which step the climate wants that company to take. So if we keep our focus on tons and the impact that companies are actually having to benefit the climate, then this problem of it's not greenwashing to me if you're following the tons. And the irony is, in the current Scope 3 system, there's actually greenwashing that's built into it that's not the company's fault. So, for example, I make progress towards my science-based target when my Scope 3 inventory goes down. My Scope 3 inventory might go down because I hired a different consultant who uses different models to complete a certain segment of my inventory. I get credit towards my science-based target. I've done nothing for the climate. So the focus being shifted back towards tons and climate leads directly to these types of mechanisms being used to achieve actual impact. And you can't hide behind not having impact if there's an option to have impact.
Yeah, thanks. Kim, wondering if you want to share get in on this at all, or share any thoughts on this.
Yeah, a couple of things. I haven't seen the research that you guys mentioned, but I certainly believe you that that's out there. What I have seen is that companies are interested in reducing emissions in their value chain at times versus outside, because they're thinking about the future. And so even though they may be very happy to buy offsets to hit carbon neutrality, and many of the companies I work with do that as well as support in value chain, but in supporting in value chain, they're thinking about 10 years from now. They want to help bend the curve down now so that they're not still paying really high prices in 10 years. And they want to join groups like the Sustainable Aviation Buyers Alliance so they can join with other companies who also want to bend that cost curve down and get those emissions in this hard to abate sector down as fast as possible and as soon as possible. So I don't see it as I don't see it as competing necessarily. I think companies will still, especially if they want to be net zero now, and many companies do, that they'll, buy offsets on top. But that doesn't mean, in my experience at all, that they wouldn't still be super eager to help actually drive the decarbonization of the businesses that they rely on to be profitable, because they're going to rely on them again in 10 years, or still in 10 years, and they need to make sure that those emissions, that they're not still having to pay $800 a ton for SAF in 2035, right? They want to be moving into a better direction.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Kim and Roger, for those points about the relationship between what companies are doing to cut their own emissions and then how they're using some of these market-based approaches. I actually just looked up the work that I mentioned by Trove Research, which is now part of MSCI. It was from a report back in June of last year, June 2023, and the key finding that I think is really interesting and goes along with just what both of you said is that the companies that made material use of carbon credits in this case actually were decarbonizing in their own operations at twice the rate of companies that didn't use credits. So that's a good example, and Will mentioned some other evidence from Ecosystem Marketplace as well. That's a good example of the ways in which this can be a both and rather than an either or, that companies are using these market-based approaches to augment and amplify what they're doing across their own operations. So with that, I think we will wrap up this panel. It's been a great discussion. I want to thank Kim Carnahan, Roger Ballantine, and Will Turner for joining us, and thank all of you for joining. We will post this online and look forward to folks joining online and watching it there as well. Again, I'm Nat Keohane of C2ES. Really appreciate the chance to walk through these issues and to hear from such a great set of panelists. Thanks, everybody, and have a great day.